Earlier this week, longtime fighting game community member and commentator James Chen had some harsh words for the online fighting game Reddit group r/Kappa. And since I technically consider myself to be a part of r/Kappa, it's safe to say that I also took offense to what James had to say. Now, it's important to note that this feud has been ongoing, not so much just Chen and Kappa, but the two hemispheres that make up the fighting game community. In short, you have the onstage player, camera personality, or behind the mic commentator portion of the FGC. And then you also have the vocal majority who might not travel as much or is seen as often across fighting game tournaments, but make up most of the consumer population when it comes to the fighting game community. And so, in this most recent feud, James Chen represents one side while r/Kappa represents the other. There's no other way to really describe it. There has been a building tension among the FGC ever since the release and reception of Street Fighter V. And closing in on 18 months of constant faltering and very little progress on Capcom's side with regards to making the game more appealing to its core audience, it's not a surprise that there's some infighting going on. The latest example of this feud was when James Chen took it upon himself to call r/Kappa for being a negative influence in the FGC. Now, no one disputes that James Chen is perhaps one of the most committed and passionate FGC members there is. However, his passion, along with his messaging, has come across a bit disingenuous in the eyes of the non-traveling FGC. Primarily, one of the most outspoken groups in fighting games, r/Kappa. If you've been around the FGC, you know that r/Kappa is not for the faint-hearted. It is known for being coarse, unapologetic, and quite cruel to those who either cross them, or in their eyes, do anything unfavorable within the fighting game community. However, the most important trait within r/Kappa is that despite their somewhat unseemly ways, they are honest with regards to how they feel about the state of the fighting game community, which has been exemplified no better with the harsh criticism of Capcom and Street Fighter V for the past year. It was during the third episode of James Chen Uncensored, his unfiltered FGC talk show, when he had some harsh words for r/Kappa and its community members, referring to them as cancer and poison, and because they don't really play anything, they shouldn't have a say within the fighting game community. After a rather emotional 10-minute rant on r/Kappa's negative influence of the fighting game community, James Chen brought up two things I found to be the most interesting. The first is how he believes that if Street Fighter dies, the fighting game community dies with it, which is a way I used to think as well until seeing how prosperous other communities can become with simply having quality games to play resulting in enjoyable environments. And this fact is shown no better within current fighting game titles like Tekken 7 and Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2, whom aren't only being praised for their quality, but also being appreciated by the community for how communicative and accommodating the developers are. And even the most critical voice within the fighting game community, r/Kappa, has been mostly positive when it comes to those games. However, my biggest takeaway from James Chen's rant was the fact that despite standing for positivity and wanting to have the fighting game community prosper, his message is ultimately deemed disingenuous, as he generalized r/Kappa for only being a hateful community, disparaging their sponsorship of players, as well as the most glaring fact, that he personally has something at stake when it comes to Capcom's and Street Fighter V's success, his employment with regards to high-profile commentating roles. Lastly, while James Chen did make valid arguments and has shown to be critical of Capcom in his own way, his way of thinking is old-fashioned. The fact that Capcom was the torchbearer for starting the competitive fighting game circuit with Capcom Pro Tour does not justify this notion that Bandai Namco's Tekken World Tour or Warner Bros. Injustice 2 Championship Series would crumble if Capcom's circuits ceased to exist. From an outside perspective, it is understandable to see how r/Kappa gets its negative reputation, as there are a few undeserving hate threads from time to time. However, as a frequent visitor and reader of r/Kappa, personally I don't believe its members are as bad as they are portrayed out to be. r/Kappa is not even technically only about fighting games. It's definitely not safe for work, and its vibe is one of freedom to express, be it fighting games or anything else. And with anything on the internet, the odds of taking offense to that is much higher. It simply comes with the territory. It would have been one thing to not give Capcom and Street Fighter V a chance. However, that was not the case. r/Kappa did not immediately turn on Street Fighter V. It simply expresses dissatisfaction with its direction, and as consumers, that lingering sense remains 18 months post-launch. And while there is a bit of an echo chamber effect and piling on the hate train isn't the greatest approach, like it or not, that is going to be the response when paying customers feel they have been wronged. At the end of the day, there is no winner within this FGC feud. However, there is definitely a case to be made for both sides. r/Kappa could go about things in a more constructive way, as they are an instrumental voice within the fighting game community. However, on the other hand, the fighting game personalities like James Chen cannot be disparaging and patronizing towards the side that is just as passionate but does not travel or seen as often. And while James Chen did apologize for his remarks, that apology still had a bit of an insincere feel to it. It was mentioned before, however, the fighting game community is at a crossroads. But I do believe that it is strong enough to sustain itself with quality games and enjoyable environments, rather than just large-scale growth, which can ultimately result in a bitter player base.